Let me kind of reel back into, earlier forms of art and what we defined as beautiful art. It usually had a high level of realism. So like when we looked at Da Vinci, right, when he's dissecting it, his whole goal was that art is already around us, perhaps. This is just me theorizing. Art is the reality itself. And so it's my job to convey that art in its much excruciating detail as is necessary to get it right, quote unquote, that which is accurately mimicking the function of that as which is observable, right? And so applying this same spectrum of thought, at some point, the desire to mimic that which exists in the observative framework, it skews away. And in that in and of itself is what makes it beautiful. How much is it changing that which is observed?
Welcome back to season 2 of the Certain Uncertainty podcast. We hope everyone's having a great start to the new year in 2022. And we have a lot of exciting new content coming on the pod for this upcoming year. So to start off, I hope you all enjoyed the Search for Meaning and final montage episode that we put out at the end of the year. And now looking forward to the new stuff that we have lined up for season 2. We're excited to start welcoming guests onto the podcast. So another big step for the new ideas and content that we'll be able to discuss and hopefully explore some new people and their expertise.
Right on, man. Yeah, so I guess with that, let's just jump right into today's podcast episode. We have a couple of questions we're going to go through, and let's jump into it. So our first question is, what makes art timeless? Is there a connecting principle between art mediums? How does the experience of art shape the landscape of future interpretation? So there's a lot here that might take more than just one episode, but we're going to try to launch into this and hopefully we tame the controversies of art itself. So what is it that makes art timeless? What makes it a span more than a few decades, for example? What makes an art, maybe it's a music piece, maybe it's a visual painting, maybe it's, some kind of cooking, right? It could be really anything that's sensed by our human 5 senses. What makes that timeless in your eyes? Let's just start there.
Yeah. So I think what was really interesting as we came to this ideation for this topic was trying to look at pieces of music or pieces of artwork and then try and understand what aspects of something like that make it so unique that it stands the test of time. So especially things like music, when we think about what makes something classical or when we look at artwork in museums that are still just so unique and complicated and beautiful to observe and analyze, and what aspects of these can we try and identify that make them so unique as a timeless piece that continues to stay successful. And I think starting off with at least the art perspective and like artwork that has really
like paintings and such.
Like paintings or even sculptures as well. So I think sculptures is easier to start with, obviously, because the level of detail and talent that goes into something so complicated, like some of the famous marble statues, is obviously incredible craftsmanship. But then into more kind of unique and dynamic territory is like paintings and sketches and really, really unique artwork. One of my favorite studies of school was art history and trying to look at what makes different pieces unique to their era. And I think when we start looking at what classically ties into art, all of the different time periods, is firstly what it represents for that period, because that was their way of expressing the society, the culture, the challenges, the changes. So at first glance, a piece of artwork like that is a window lens into history or a representation of what was happening at that time. But then what's interesting is if you subtract that, the subjective analysis of a piece of art, and you look at purely the colorimetric and visual representations, can we start to pick apart what makes this piece so advanced as to be perceived as so beautiful that it stands the test of time? And I think that's kind of where my thoughts are going right now.
Right. Trying to deduce the metrics from and I mean, color is just one variable, right? And I mean, I assume that you're talking about the whole, I guess, context of the color palette with relationships to other color palettes that preceded it. And, it's setting the stage for the next set of color palettes, but it's also about form and shape. And it's about, not necessarily a unifying color palette always. Sometimes it's a chaotic frenzy of color palettes, and that's what makes the art piece. Like with splatter paint, for example, there isn't really a unifying color palette, but that maybe is what the color palette is. It's non-uniform. And so just kind of thinking about it from that lens, color doesn't necessarily, I think, provide the insight necessary to build out that timelessness. It is, we have to look at, like when it comes to paintings, we have to look at what were the stories that they were trying to tell within each one of these art forms. I think that's where, and that's very abstract and it's non-numerical, right? Which is our problem. But maybe we can kind of whittle out into the numerical land as we kind of piece out what the story of an art form is trying to be. Because at all levels, the artist, and they don't necessarily know what story is going to actually be interpreted from, and that we all vary in how we interpret colors and shapes and so forth, and the morphology of these connections. But, there is a unifying story being told when they're initially, it could be through technique, through brush strokes, right? The roughness, the smoothness of the brush is what binds the violence of a piece, perhaps, maybe. And so maybe we start there. What's the continuity of storytelling that was actually involved in the process of that artistic representation? In this case, it's a painting. Mm-hmm. So let me just kind of pose that question for you, and maybe we can constrict it a little bit more. But what is a good story to tell within an art piece? Maybe we start there.
Sure. I mean, when we're looking at the pieces that are in the most famous museums in the world, like the Louvre and in the Met and the MoMA in Chicago, it's looking at the level of expertise and pure talented craftsmanship that went into, picking every single size of brush and the layering and the combination of oils and different pieces to represent, different shades and depths. And as we look at the progression of art through different cultures and periods, you can very clearly see the changes and familiarities that kind of got carried with and that got left behind as only changes in society happened. So when we look at art and study the different paintings from hundreds and thousands of years, you can see that maybe their physical tools didn't actually change very much. It was the capabilities and depth to which people were able to express an idea onto a piece of artwork. And I think when we look at what is a good story to tell, or at least how do we tell a good story through artwork, my first kind of thought as we look at the most famous pieces is the level of relationship and, I guess, feelings that are manifested in the person who's actually observing that artwork. And I think that is what is the great line of a truly masterful artist, is that when you can look at something and have an emotion attached with it, or it invokes some set of feelings that you didn't know that you would be able to express toward just this two-dimensional object with a three-dimensional representation. And I think that is what's most unique and special. But the real question is, how do you do that? And I think it's the same way in music. Like when you can listen to a piece of music and clearly tell that this combination of notes is melancholy or sad, mm-hmm. or uplifting and motivational. It's just music. It's mathematical relationships between patterns that somehow allow us to perceive a feeling associated through that music. But it's like, we were never taught that. You were never told that like this music is powerful and uplifting, where this one is, saddening and calming. It's just that it innately exists within you and the way you perceive things. And it could be very similar to a piece of artwork where you may be looking at something that represents the French Revolution and, the number of people who sacrificed their lives and passed away, but you may not know that. So say you're just looking at a piece of artwork and the talent that went into the contrasting colors, the depth, maybe the expressions on faces it invokes emotion. And I think that's how you would try and tell the best story, is it makes people feel what the story represents.
Okay. Right. So, there's this emotional extraction from the story that is being told, and there is perhaps some variation in the emotional interpretation thereof. Mm-hmm. Right. So let me ask, does a good story have a constrained set of emotional experiences that can come out of it? Or does it have a highly variable one, meaning that it's applicable to a lot of different lenses versus, you see the story, you feel this specific way. It's going to be melancholy, right? There's no wiggle room, right? That is what it is. That's the story that's being told. Or do you think a good, good being subjective here, good being one that is defined by most preferential to a larger set of audience members, right? That's what I'm using the word good. But does the good story then, a truly good one, have this variation in that emotional atmosphere, let's call it, or before, just straight melancholy, one emotion? What do you think? I mean, I think this is the subjective element to it, but I'm just kind of curious.
I would think that it's purely like subjective, because you and I could look at the same piece of artwork and from our different life experiences have completely different associated emotions. If we've experienced something, similar to it before or have never seen it, you're going to have completely different thoughts about what comes to mind. But say we're both, starting from the same baseline and we look at a piece of artwork, should we theoretically have the same reaction? Say we're like identical twins, not even like identical, but like a clone, right? Would we theoretically have the same reaction looking at a piece of artwork?
If we have the same prerequisite experience?
Yeah.
It really depends on us having a uniform interpretation for all prerequisite elements, which, by our own biology is essentially impossible, just because we have such levels of variation that have trickled through our own genetics, and then our interpretation is going to have some changing element as a function of that. And so, no, right? But there is a really good point there, in that when you're evaluating a piece of art, it is less about that piece of art and more so about all the other pieces of art that came before it, right? Because that then binds the spectrum in which you're able to view it. The experience of art conditions yourself to then look for key elements in the present art form that you're looking at, right? It's because you've seen so many previous art forms that had this human shape that when you see this kind of inorganic human shape, it catches your eye, right? Because you have a trained eye for a specific way of viewing the human body, let's say. Now, all of a sudden, the artistic impression of it is much more impactful, simply because it's different than the other earlier forms. And I think, whenever we're looking at different artistic renaissance moments, it is because they've taken the morphology of a specific type of art context and bended it in a way that almost creates like a distraction. It's like an eyesore, and it's like, what the hell is that doing there, right? Why is this, bodily disformation suddenly, in front of so many people? It's because it is an eyesore, and that eyesore then transforms into something of beauty because it shifted a fundamental starting perception on how to view art in the first place. It added more variables or more key points to look at, more abstract focal points, non-indicated by the visual itself. It's a focal point in reference to another piece of art that came before it.
Yeah. When you were talking about like the trained eye and like how, say you because you've seen it before, you've studied what, an anatomical body is supposed to look like. And I remember that the first thing that comes to my mind when you said that was Da Vinci, who was such a fantastically talented artist that everyone's so familiar with. And something cool that I learned about at one time was that he would dissect, cadavers in order to understand the anatomical muscles and layers in the body so that he could, paint and sculpt these incredible figures. And it's that level of, I think, dedication and knowledge that really pushes that to the next level that could make something so talented that it becomes timeless. But what really makes me excited and curious to like still think about this topic is there are prodigies in three fields or three or so fields where they say you can be a prodigy in math, chess, or music, right? Something like that. So I think a fourth would probably be art. So when you think about the concept of a prodigy, is someone who is so incredibly talented at a topic, even though they have not had, extensive studying and teaching and mentorship in that area, where you can have someone that's just so good at the piano or guitar that they're able to recreate sounds and they can put exactly what's in their mind into this piece. And that is so interesting to me because that means that they have some sort of overlapping fundamental between the four of those. So
what is the connecting principle? And we asked this question initially, right? Is, and I would be careful because the art, I would say art is embedded within the three. I think chess is a form of art. I think maths is a form of art, and that it is an abstraction of something that doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
It is something that holds an imaginary value. And then because of that imaginary value, we call it art. Because, it serves some function other than what is given by the words used to describe it, right? A number has no value unless it is a number that is talking about some material thing. I have 3 cups of coffee, right? 3 is some arbitrary artifact of communication that only signifies meaning when we have this material association to it. And chess is no more than another facet of associating pieces to it, right? Your piece is the medium. Each one of those chess pieces is a different brush. It's a different stroke in which you can, move the pen on the paper, right? And each one has its own function. And so I'm gonna kind of shift gears a little bit because we have these tools, right? We have these chess pieces, we have these brushes, we have these, audio synthesizers or pianos or musical instruments. And like you said, there is this defining principle that the prodigy uses to then relate whatever they're thinking inside to the outside world. And it has some level of accuracy in mimicking the actual thoughts that are purveying in that individual's mind. And so there's something there in the concept of mimicry, right? And so let me kind of reel back into, earlier forms of art and what we defined as beautiful art. It usually had a high level of realism. So when we looked at Da Vinci, right, when he's dissecting it, his whole goal was that art is already around us, perhaps. This is just me theorizing. Art is the reality itself. And so it's my job to convey that art in its much excruciating detail as is necessary to get it right, quote unquote, that which is accurately mimicking the function of that as which is observable, right? And so applying this same spectrum of thought, at some point, the desire to mimic that which exists in the observative framework, it skews away. And in that in of itself is what makes it beautiful. How much is it changing that which is observed, right? How much is it actually mimicking? And it's all in context too, right? Because if I have a lot of realism pieces, my eye begins to blur all the features because it's just too much to look at, and it's not as artistic. It's not as creative because it's not bending the will of that which I'm already seeing. It needs to, bend the will of how we are originally perceiving this thing, whatever it may be. Maybe it's a human being. Maybe it's a emotion. I didn't know melancholy could feel like that when I'm listening to a musical piece. I didn't know that melancholy had that depth. What do you mean? What melancholy is an emotion? You're applying, between the other two emotions, some value within those two, right? And within that connection of the emotions itself, the value exists in between. You see what I'm saying there? Yeah.
No, and it's fascinating because when we think about the whole range of emotions and almost personalities, say emotions are like the amino acids to a personality as they are to a protein, right? And when you think about the capability of a specific length of notes when put together individually, nothing, but when put together, they represent or can invoke a feeling, is one of the most unique things that I think we have just so readily available to us. Is you can hear something and see something, and with no other, physical obstructions or alterations to your current state, you can actually change how you're feeling with that addition. And I know this is even something that's used in new therapeutic models, but without going that way, it makes me wonder, when we look at the actual mathematical representations that could exist in a piece of music or artwork, it's like a puzzle or a lock and a key, essentially, where it's we have the ability to perceive that in the way that it is created. So it makes me wonder, is there undiscovered levels of musical combinations that can make you feel a way that you've never felt before?
What is the current form of the lock that humans reside in? Right? Because it's a lock and key model, right? Meaning that you have the key, which in this case is the art form, and the lock is the interpreter.
Yeah.
What shape is the interpreter? And so like, this is what we were saying before, the sequence of the art that they see beforehand shapes that lock. So, only a certain level of keys are going to work for them. Because over time, every art piece just slowly, subtly shifts the actual lock so that key fits into. It's like if you every single day came back to your house and would have to switch your keys and go back to the shop and, change out the key, right? Because every day that lock is changing. And that is, the interpretive lens that we sit on as we're growing and developing preference. We're developing opinions. And so this is where I was kind of trying to bring up this idea of story and the associative mimicry involved in it, because I think that's kind of that's our first like numerical lens we can look at it. What level of mimicry, how well is this fictional story told in this art piece relative to what actually is observed by a larger group of people, right? Because that's what it is. Art is a observative framework that we're resting on and then slightly tweaking, well, maybe not tweaking because we're observing it and that's what it is, but it's slightly tweaking reality as is seen by others, but to the person who's creating the art, that's their reality in a sense. They know no other way of thinking of it.
I mean, think about like the surrealism in like Dali, like Salvador Dali, who took incredibly abstract approaches to his artwork and had the melting clock, over the edge of an infinite ledge, and all of the really abstract pieces of artwork that came from his representation and era. When we look at something like that, it starts to question everything but reality or what's in reality. So there's like two really unique schools, or far more than two, but compared to the hyperrealism of a painting that's so detailed or representative of just the actual image of the reality, or the story that was being told in that framework, like something like the Revolution. And then when you go so far as to create a piece of artwork that is a physical representation of the abstracts that are in existence, like time, like the perception of time, like the physicality of consciousness and emotions. He was able to create, visual representations of that, which is super, super cool.
Right.
And it's the mimicry, like you were talking about.
Would you say, so this is going to be a tough one, but would you say that fiction, so like the scene that he created, like, with the dripping clocks, the melting clocks, or that's the same guy, right? Yeah. Would you say that the fictional scene he created is actually true? Meaning that maybe that scene doesn't actually exist in reality, but the thoughts it creates are real and are concrete and are applicable to multiple situations.
100%.
And so it's less that the visual scene, there's not a literal truth to the art, but there is an abstracted truth of it. And that all art has its own unifying truth, but it is not literal, meaning you can't observe it as well. You can only observe it through the lens that they're pushing it through. In this case, the melting clocks represent something. I won't get into the interpretation of it, but you see what I'm saying? Like, that there is a distinction between a literal truth of an art piece, meaning like, how well does it actually relate to reality, and then an abstracted truth, which is how applicable is the perception that it creates in that individual who's observing it. How applicable is that to other things in their life?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It goes kind of hand in hand with the level of expertise and talent that go into manifesting something like that, where you can take an abstract truth or thought that exists within your mind and to create artistic representations of a whole idea. And the interpretations of artwork like Dali are so cool to me, because you get to think about some of these kind of far out there ideas about the questions of our existence and our perceptions and, emotions, and have those recreated in a way that makes sense without having to have words or explanations go along with it, I think is the true, metric of artwork that stands the test of time and makes it truly classic or classical, and that it doesn't matter what period you're looking at this piece in, it will still make sense. And it's cool to me that the thoughts that they had then at that time are the same thoughts that we have now at this time. And I think that's what makes it, transcendent across generations and generations, and in different periods of time, especially like music. Like when you can listen to the true complexity and beauty of like Beethoven, it can still invoke the exact same, or maybe not the exact, but very, very similar emotions as the people that listened to it way back when he wrote it, which is really cool.
Yeah, I'm stuck on this idea of what makes sense. And let me explain a little bit. So there's this quote, and I'm going to butcher it. I don't remember exactly, but I'll just explain the concept here. But the concept is basically when you're seeing a whole bunch of people moving chaotically, it is only when you apply the music in the background that you realize they're dancing. Right. And so in some sense, the art form itself needs the context of other things. And so that's what makes it make sense. Right. It's almost like the combination of art pieces is an absolute necessity to understand its actual artistic value. It is a combinatorics problem of itself. And so when we say like it makes sense given the time, it is also about it makes sense given the stimuli in that current time, right? When I'm looking at these people moving their bodies, it's crazy to me. And then I start hearing the music and I'm like, oh, they're listening to like electro drums, like makes sense, They're like doing some rave dances and it's all good to go. Right. And like before I was like, are these people all like on drugs, And it's like, no, they're just listening to some electro drums, which is a drug in and of itself, but I won't go there. Right. Yeah. You see what I mean? Like, what do you think it means to like make sense? Like when I look at an art piece and I'm just like, that just makes sense. Like, what am I saying?
I feel like it has to be the patterns. So our innate visual capabilities of recognizing patterns that exist in things. Our brains are designed to see that everywhere we look. We're looking for patterns, the feelings of visual patterns, the feelings that we create from those are all patterns. It's our brain's way of learning what makes sense. Otherwise, if we didn't have that capability, everything we looked at would look like just a messy nothing. You would never be able to you would never find a way to be able to forage for something, complete a task, look through complex layers of, leaves and earth and animals. And I think without getting too far into the actual survival and developmental levels of visual pattern recognition, it's now in the other lens or the other half of that scope, which is we are smart enough and intelligent enough as a species to be able to look at something and have a level of appreciation for the specific patterns that were put together in this representation. And I think when we look at something like artwork and say, why does this even make sense? Like Andy Pollock, right? Andy Warhol, who did like the mess, like the completely random splatter paint kind of stuff. And you look at that and you just goes, this is nothing, but it's also really cool. And it's like, how do you make sense of the chaos? And I think that is one of the most interesting psychology related pieces of artwork, because there's really cool analyses out there that talk about the level of randomness and chaos in his artwork and his paintings that are so well balanced. And the people who feel an emotional rise come from that artwork have inner relatability to those pieces, whether it be chaos or seeing this level of chaos in front of your eyes actually brings you some peace inside. And there's really cool analyses that talk about that.
My first question is just trying to figure out the relative chaos that a piece might need to be. Is that mostly related to the surrounding environment, right? So if I put a chaotic art piece on a wall of graffiti, for example, will that art piece have the same value as if I just put it on a white canvas, right? And so the art piece itself is super chaos, right? So graffiti versus the white background, right? But my thinking is that, the inherent sense of contrast and the white background and then the chaotic painting would mean the most attention grabbing art piece, and therefore the most interpretive because it's grabbing my attention, versus the graffiti, which is adding all the background static. And then I'm not able to actually, pick a focal point and interpret the value of the art. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that, again, the art piece itself is not as important as what came preceding it and what exists around it. Like when I look at the Mona Lisa and I don't mean this in a bad way, but when I'm looking at the Mona Lisa, and if you ever go to the Louvre and you actually see all the people with their, iPhone cameras up, it ruins the piece for me, right? It does, right? It's not as esoteric, right? It in and itself just changes how I interpret it, because it's a small little piece and there's always, iPhone cameras in my face, and I simply can't evaluate the art piece for what it is. Yeah. Right. And all of a sudden, the art piece doesn't really have its own place now. It's muddied up by all the hands in the air, which is all part of the art. And that, whatever I'm seeing, whatever I'm observing creates the artistic landscape from which I'm making my interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say that's the added layer that goes on top of any like experience. And it's like not only what you're looking at in the exact focal point, but the other layer on top of that is the immersive environment in which you're viewing something. It also changes the experience 100%. And I think that level is really cool as it gets worked into performances. When you think about like how a museum is orchestrated, when you have to go through and is there an actual intentional pattern, or not pattern, but order sequence in which these were placed. And that is in itself super cool to think about, like the story that could be told between multiple pieces of artwork pieced together. And when we think about like the capability we have in our own mind to group up periods paintings together and say, these all have similar characteristics and similar ways of telling a story, and they come from the same period. It's the school of thought that is from the Renaissance or proto-Renaissance or, medieval period. When you look at what were they talking about and how did they represent it, we can inherently look at that analysis. But if you were to try to teach a computer to make that level of comparison between periods of artwork, how would you teach a computer to look at artwork and say these are similar period or these are not similar period? You would not say that these are overlapping story modalities.
I think our metric here is its level of mimicry. I think that is where I keep going. It's like how well. So like what I would do is I'd take a bunch of pictures of Earth, and I would basically try to get it experienced in what Earth looks like. What is, trying to get the depth, get all the elements, just, massive amount of photos of the Earth, of ways of perceiving the Earth. Right. And then over time, look at the relative mimicry in those photos relative to the art form itself. And you could create some kind of trend of mimicry. And I'm curious, it's just one variable, but I'm wondering if that variable itself is most salient in being able to understand trends of artistic thinking. Like for example, all of math is essentially a mimicry engine. How well can I create some abstract understanding of this that will work no matter what this is in any environment? I can put this in a glass of water and my function will still work, or I can throw it up in the air and it'll still work. Yep. Right. It's an assessment of mimicry in relationship to the dynamic nature of Earth. So maybe, going back to the computer, how do I teach the computer to assemble that sequence? I'd probably need videos too, right? I would need something observing a dynamic environment, right? In the same way that we are.
I mean, to your point, mathematics is the only vocabulary that we have to represent our existence
in a mimicable way.
Yeah.
Right.
Like we could tell, so you could tell a story, you could write an entire book.
Reproducible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You cannot recreate reality with a story. Even the most detailed story could not fully recreate our reality. Mathematics is the only vocabulary that we have to recreate or reproduce a physical existence.
Right. And this is how all the, virtual AR, this is what the systems they work on. They work on our fundamental understandings of math to recreate something of familiar association, which we call the natural environment around us. And so coming back to it, let's try to get in at this timeless question and kind of wrap it up in a nutshell here as a function of perhaps mimicry or, a function of relative mimicry perhaps is a more accurate, right? We have the Renaissance era, which is pretty hyper realistic, and then all of a sudden we move into the more abstract forms of morphology, and then following in the 19th century and so forth. And there's a huge just mimicry change right there. How well does that match something that we can actually pick up and see and touch?
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. What are your thoughts there? Like, what are the other variables that we're missing is what I'm trying to get at
for like the most
timeless understanding of art.
I think if you were to have a way to either quantify a piece of artwork, which is so difficult because there's so many subjective variables that you have to, it may be near impossible because there's so many subjective variables that you have to account for. But if you were to give some sort of a value score to a piece of timeless art, if you were to include the subjective capability of storytelling and the balance of detail to three-dimensionality in something, and then also maybe the emotional existence or derivation that comes from viewing a piece of artwork. I think and it sounds weird, if you were to give those each a score, and the score is high enough, then it would surpass the threshold to be timeless. And and there may be a far better way to try and describe what could make something so unique that it will last forever. But
right, and there's a filtering function for each medium, depending on what senses it's stimulating, and if it's a combination of senses, like if it's a music with an art, like a dance form in front of it, right? There's two sounds. There is a filtering needed to assess that level of threshold, and again, to me, it just keeps going back to this mimicry function where it's like, could I do that too?
Yeah.
Could I recreate that? Like, and I think this is what made plays so popular back in their early days, is that they were just mimicking human behavior in perhaps a satirical way, which allowed it to stray from that mimicry into a new way of perceiving how things could have transpired. So I feel like that's more or less my answer to the timeless question is we have to understand its relative mimicry. How relatable is it? Right. Yeah. It's a pretty easy way of, but it's more than just how relatable. It's how relatable in context, which is a really hard question. Yeah. And hence it's subsequent numerical impossibility. It's because we can't calculate all the prerequisite experiences of each individual human and then take the convolution of all of those experiences into one, trend of beauty, let's call it. Yeah. I don't know. That's where I kind of think about that.
Yeah, I think when thinking about like the muscle or maybe the spectrum that you have to appreciate a piece of music or artwork, I would put it on the same scale as the ability to go through sensory deprivation all the way to the other end. Right. So it's on this range of, say, all the way on the right side or whatever, you have the most extreme reaction to a piece of artwork. Like when you see people that are looking at art at a museum and it's so beautiful that they actually start crying, or they're at a musical performance and they're so connected to this experience that people actually start crying, right? Because it evokes such strong emotions for whatever reason, and then go all the way to the left and the other end of that spectrum. I would put that as that's when you're in full sensory deprivation, and the whole science behind what that does to your biology is fascinating, and could be an interesting topic, but I think it's a good spot to leave you all thinking and wrap up.
Agreed. And, just closing notes. Thank you so much for watching. And this has been episode 18 of the Certain Uncertainty podcast.
Thanks, everyone.
If you made it this far into the podcast and want to hear more content, please consider following us on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, and sharing today's podcast link with your close friends. We hope this podcast incites you to start some interesting conversations and expand on some of the ideas we've discussed. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Certain Uncertainty podcast, a podcast aimed at unveiling the certainly uncertain relationships between some of the most complex systems known to man.